Meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the April meeting of the Fyke Nature Association. Sue here, one of our trustees. I'll make this quick. I'm going to just read the name of the board nominations. And if I don't hear from anybody by the end of tomorrow, the elections will stand. President Michael Matola, First Vice President Gabrielle Schmidt, Treasurer Kurt Munz, Corresponding Secretary Mimi Brout, Recording Secretary Molly Gardner, Trustee Darlene Lembo, Trustee Doug Morrell, Trustee Sue Doherty. And so if anybody has any objections, contact me by phone or email or text or anything you want by tomorrow evening. If not, the elections will stand. And with that, I just want to thank all our board members and Celery Farm staff for, I was there today and everybody was just saying how wonderful the place looked, and I really appreciate everything everybody does there. And I'll just mention, if you haven't already signed up or want to participate in Stepping Up for the Celery Farm, is April 30th and May 1st. So you can do it either day, both, one or the other, and or just pledge if you want, or help participate, and contact Gabby on that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Monica, who's going to announce our presenter.
Thank you, Mike. So Monica Cardoza, and I'm the programs chair for Fyke Nature Association, which manages the Celery Farm. And happy Earth Day. I'd like to say I planned this for Earth Day, but it was just kind of a lucky thing. So before I start, I just wanted to give you a brief background on the Celery Farm, because I think we have a lot of new people here, and it'll give you a little introduction to the area that our speaker is going to talk about. So just north of Lake Appert in the Celery Farm and to the east of the Greenway entrance to the Celery Farm lies the Klomburg Woods, which is a deciduous wooded wetland. The Klomburg Woods was named for Allendale Mayor Al Klomburg, who served in the 90s and was a big supporter of the Celery Farm. In Jim Wright's book, In the Presence of Nature, it's a book about the Celery Farm. He writes that the Wolf Clan of the Lenni Lenape Native Americans are thought to be among the first humans to live nearby. And judging from the arrowheads and primitive tools found in the area, the shallow lake and the Allendale Brook that runs through it provided fertile hunting ground. The marshy area was known as Wolf Swamp. In the 1600s, that brought the Europeans, and in the 1700s, founding father John Fell owned a large piece of property, including what is now the Celery Nature Farm. And his house, the Fell House, is just across the street from the entrance to the Celery Farm and is still standing there today. In the 1800s, much of the forests were cleared for farmland. A Swiss immigrant named Henry Appert bought the property in 1888, drained it, and converted it to fields. First, they grew onions, then celery, and that went out of business in the mid-50s. By 1956, the land was for sale, and thanks to local naturalist Stiles Thomas, the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, and New Jersey's Green Acres program in 1981, it became the first town in America to purchase wetlands and save them as open space. That would be Allendale. Today, the Celery Farm has grown to 107 acres. 53 bird species breed there, and over 248 species have been recorded. And tonight we get to expand on our Celery Farm knowledge beyond the birds and the history to include the trees and plants that thrive there. Tonight we join Mike Lefebvre as he identifies the flora found in the Klomburg Woods. Mike is a nature enthusiast who has documented the flora of New Jersey natural areas, including Garrett Mountain and Rifle Camp Park, and authored the nature blog, New Jersey Urban Forest, for several years. He worked in the corporate world for more than 12 years and is currently a full-time student completing a bachelor's degree in Earth and Environmental Science from Montclair State University. Feel free during the presentation to use the Q&A for your questions, and Mike will answer them. And with that, I'm very happy to present to you tonight Mike Lefebvre.
Thank you very much, Monica. Appreciate that. Hello, everyone. So as Monica mentioned, my name is Mike Lefebvre. We'll be talking tonight about the plants at the Celery Farms, Klomburg Woods. I wanted to talk about the Klomburg Woods because I think that if you are familiar with the Celery Farm, you've been there, you're probably familiar with the path that goes around Lake Appert, gone around the path. But, you know, I didn't know when I first went to the Celery Farm that there's more to it. You know, you have the Klomburg Woods, which is north of the Celery Farm, and I don't think too many people go there. So my goal for today was kind of to discuss with you some of the plants that are found within Klomburg Woods and also on the border of Klomburg Woods, so you can kind of get a feel of what's there, you know, if you want to go explore, especially this time of year, because to me, this is a really exciting time of year. You got, besides the birds coming in, you got all sorts of, you know, flowers coming up, you know, before the leaves come out. It's a great time. And once they're gone for another year. So this is really, you only have a limited time to get out there and look for these flowers. So later on in the presentation, I'll talk about some of the flowers that you'll see if you go to the Klomburg Woods or any of the natural areas here in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. So let's go on to the next slide. So who am I? As you know, as Monica mentioned, I am I'm an environmental science student, Montclair State University. I did keep a nature blog, NewJerseyUrbanForest.com. It is now retired, but I still do try to visit as often as I can different natural sites. I do document the flora of many sites as a hobby, something that I really enjoy doing, and so it grows and what's not growing, and maybe figuring out why isn't it growing and whatnot. And one of the reasons why something might not be growing, one of the last slides we'll talk about here today. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So this is Klomburg Woods right here. So I'm going to go down to the picture here. So Klomburg Woods is in the north. This is Lake Appert. Okay, down here where it says Bergen County, that's actually Lake Appert. The blue, as they say here, is all the wetlands. And looking over on the right-hand side here, you got Allendale Brook, which is flowing to the right of Lake Appert, and it starts up here, right? And enters the preserve from the north. But you also have multiple tributary streams that feed into Allendale Brook. So this is basically a gigantic wetland, and so is the Lake Appert section. But as I'll talk about in the next slide, they're both wetlands, but they're both different kinds of wetlands, okay? So as Monica mentioned, the Klomburg Woods, they are deciduous wooded wetlands. And, you know, the soil is comprised of the swamp and marsh deposits, you know, typical, as I said here, of freshwater wetlands, okay, and what it's comprised of. And you got the clay, and clay, what it does is it holds water. It doesn't really go. You might notice it on your yard. If you have clay in your yard, the water is not going to go anywhere. It's going to puddle. And that's kind of what happens in some parts of a swamp forest, okay? The water has no place to go. So now what I like to do is I like to talk about the difference between the Klomburg Woods wetlands and the wetlands that comprise the rest of around Lake Appert, the main area, so to speak, of the Celery Farm, okay? So Klomburg Woods, what is the difference between a swamp and a marsh, right? So a swamp, let me just say something real fast about that. So a swamp, like, for example, many people, when they call the Meadowlands, you know, the New Jersey Meadowlands, they'll say that's a swamp. And at one time I called it a swamp too. But it's actually, most of the Meadowlands is not a swamp. And why that is because it lacks woody vegetation, okay? And it's just like the case with the Celery Farm. So the Klomburg Woods has woody vegetation, such as an example here, swamp white oak, okay? And that's different than a marsh, which mostly has herbaceous species and grass species, such as, you know, the cattails here, okay? So if you find you're in a wetland and you see mostly grasses, and, you know, occasionally you'll have a shrub here and there, but it's mostly grasses, well, you're in a marsh, right? If you're in a wetland like Klomburg Woods, you're seeing mostly trees and shrubs, but there's a large cooling on the ground, especially, you know, maybe this time of year with the snow melt and lots of rain. you're going to see that you are actually in a swamp. So that's a true swamp versus a marsh. Okay. So I want to definitely bring up the difference between the two different types of wetland environments or habitats that you will find when you visit the celery farm. So let's go on to the next slide. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the history here. And Monica did a good job talking about that. So here's an aerial about almost 90 years ago of the celery farm, right? Is when it was a celery farm. So this is the future Lake Appert down here. But if you look to the north, Klomburg Woods is still there. And if you look in 2020, there's Klomburg Woods. So Klomburg Woods has been there for a while, okay? Which is an important thing because it'll help us introduce when we talk about the first species, okay? So let's go on to our plants. So let's see. So this is the trees. And actually, I just want to pause a second on this slide. Now, I'm not talking about a particular species in mind, but if you were to look outside during the day, of course, this time of year, this is kind of what the trees look like right now, right? You got the early flowers coming on, like the red maples, and maybe even some of the birches are starting to come back. So it's always an encouraging thing, right? After a long winter to see some life happening on the trees. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so the first tree here I want to talk about, which is also, you'll find this in Klomburg Woods, is the American beech. Now, the American beech is not a true wetland tree per se, but it does have a tolerance for wet soils. I wanted to mention here, especially the bark, right? So if you look at the bark on the American beech, it's nice and smooth. And what does that usually mean for people? People like to carve their initials and who they love and whatnot, and the year and whatnot into the bark. Unfortunately, what that does is it invites disease into the American beech trees. So it's really a practice that should be discouraged. And I mean, I'm not going into a forest to look to see who loves who. You want to see the trees for the trees, so to speak. But going back, let's go back a couple slides, right? As I mentioned here, the Klomburg Woods, they existed even 90 years ago, and before then, right? The reason why I'm harping on that is because the American beech is part of the final stage of forest succession. What is forest succession? So forest succession, that's if you have, for example, a farm field, and the farm field is now abandoned, right? You have like certain grasses that'll come in, and eventually you'll have like maybe a tree like an eastern red cedar and so on and so forth until eventually a young forest will come on. And then after the young forest goes away, you have more mature tree species such as sugar maple and American beech. And that's an indicator that forest has been there for quite a while and has not been disturbed. So when you see American beech, that's a good thing, right? That means that forest has not been disturbed and it's been there for quite some time. And so the cool thing is this tree, has been recorded reaching 120 feet, but typically they're around 80 feet. Another interesting thing that I wasn't aware of, and I'm not sure you may or may not be aware of this, is that apparently back, when mass tree clear cutting was at the turn of last century was taking place, they're thinking that the passenger pigeon became extinct because they were heavily dependent on the beech nut. Okay, so if you don't have the beech nut, what are they going to feed on? So that's one of the reasons potentially why the passenger pigeon went extinct. Okay. And then I wanted to go on the next slide here. So look at this picture here, right? You got beech drops. That's what these plants are called. You might not even notice them as you're going here, right? They're actually considered parasitic because they get all their nutrients from the roots of the American beech tree, but the tree doesn't get any benefit from the beech drops. But the beech drop is not harming the American beech. The American beech will grow just fine. It's just that they're not getting a benefit from the beech drop, whereas the beech drop, of course, is getting the benefit from the American beech. So another important thing with forest succession is that when you have trees like American beech and sugar maple, you have once the leaves are out, you have a deep shade on the forest floor. And that actually prevents, as you can imagine, most other plants from growing underneath it. So typically what you will find growing underneath an American beech tree is beech drops. And you also will find many other American beech trees. So American beech trees, they reproduce by not only the beech nuts, right, the ones that don't get eaten, but they also reproduce by clones. So they'll set up sprouts. And if you go into the forest, or even in Klomburg Woods, and you see an American beech with a bunch of little ones going all around it, well, chances are those are clones of the mother tree. Usually you'll find the big mother tree, and then you'll find all the little clones all around it. So that's kind of a cool thing. I did want to mention here that a tree that sometimes gets confused with the American beech is the European beech, right? And it does look similar, and they get to massive sizes. But one thing that, generally speaking, you'll find European beech in like parklands and maybe even as a street tree, but you really won't find American beech because they don't really tolerate the urban environment too well. They have a low tolerance for pollution. Oh, another cool thing about American beech, and you might have seen it when you go into Klomburg Woods or any other natural area in the wintertime, the tree, especially the younger trees, they retain their leaves. They're not green anymore, but they retain their leaves through the wintertime. So it's kind of cool when you walk and you see a little bit of color, and you hear the rustling, of the wind going through the leaves in the winter. It's kind of eerie and kind of cool. So it's something to consider. So those leaves actually will stay on the tree until the springtime, and then they fall off. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide here. We got, let's talk about what I call the redwoods of the East, the tulip tree, which is one of my favorite trees. Now the tulip tree is actually early on in its succession. It's not a tree that you would find at the end, growing at the end. So in other words, you'll find it growing in a mature forest like this picture here, but you won't really find young saplings growing in the deep forest because they're not really good on shade. So they do reach heights up to 200 feet. Usually it's 100 feet. They grow very straight. Branches, as you see here, don't appear till way up and high in the tree, about 80 feet. They live up to 500 years. But again, they are shade intolerant. So you will find these trees growing in a mature forest such as Klomburg Woods, but these trees have been there for a long time. They're not new. So generally speaking, unless you're on the outskirts of Klomburg Woods, or you have an area that maybe have a blowdown, a storm came, knocked down some trees, you won't find tulip tree saplings in the deep forest. Okay. So tulip tree, why is it called that? Well, there's two things, at least to me, there's two things. Most people call it the tulip tree because of the shape of the leaves. So as you can see here, kind of looks like a tulip, right? But you also, to me, you have these flowers. These are the flowers. I know the picture isn't the greatest quality here, but these are the tulip tree flowers that appear around late May, early June. And they, to me, they'll kind of like a tulip too, but I'll let you guys decide what you think, looks like a tulip, whether it's a leaf or a flower, maybe even none of the above. So the tulip tree is a really cool tree. So again, be on the lookout about the end of May, June, early June, for these cool looking flowers. They go pretty big. It can be a common street tree, or you can find it people growing in their yards. It's a fast growing tree, so can be a bit weedy though. So just be on the lookout for that. And so it is host to the eastern swallow butterfly. The northern cardinals, white-footed mice, they eat the seeds. Okay, so they do provide benefits in addition to looking like a beautiful tree. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide here. Oh, this one here is my favorite tree. I got one outside my window, black cherry tree. So similar to the tulip tree, this is not one that you would find in a mature forest. This is actually found more on the outskirts of Klomburg Woods. But this tree, while it might not look like much, it's like a wildlife bonanza, right? They provide so much benefit to wildlife. As I say here, 70 species of birds at least feed on this tree. You got American robins, cedar waxwings, downy woodpeckers, just to name a few. The berries, when they come out in the late summer, when they're mature, like they're gone. You'll have cedar waxwings getting drunk off these things. I haven't seen it personally, but this is what I've heard. They love this tree. So if you have a black cherry tree on your property, please keep it. It's such a benefit to wildlife. It really it's a wonderful tree. Again, it might not look like much. So For example, when you think of a cherry tree, you might be thinking of like what goes on in Branchbrook Park in Newark, right? Where you have all the beautiful Japanese cherry trees, and they are a beautiful tree. But this tree here, the black cherry tree, really provides a lot of benefit to wildlife, and it's a powerhouse. Definitely keep it if you have any on your property. And one thing I want to mention, it might be hard to tell in this photo here, the PowerPoint, but this is a very young black cherry tree. Okay, now black cherry tree looks like when it's young, looks like another tree, which I won't really touch upon in this presentation, but it's called a black birch. Okay, they both have like these lenticles, which are these white stripes going across, so they can look the same when they're young. Now the biggest difference between, if you want to know the difference between a black birch and a black cherry tree, is the smell, right? So if you break a branch and it's a black birch, you get a nice pleasant wintergreen sniff, right? But if you break a branch and it's a black cherry, you're going to regret it. But I do want to mention that, as I say here, black cherry is one of the first native trees to repopulate an area that's been disturbed. It's actually the most common native tree in Central Park in New York City, and it's usually as far as Celery Farm, you'll find it on the outskirts of Klomburg, where it's in more sunny areas, or if you have a disturbance within the woods itself, on a drier spot, you'll find black cherry. As I say here, it's not tolerant of the dense, deep woods. The mature black cherry tree, this is a mature one now. This looks totally different than a mature black birch tree, which still retains the lenticles, those white stripes, vertical stripes that go across it, or horizontal stripes, I should say. Black cherry to me looks like burnt potato chips. It really does. So if you see this type of a tree growing, chances are you found yourself a mature black cherry tree. Okay. So anyway, I can't emphasize how important this tree is for wildlife, for birds. It's when those berries are out, and this is what I'll talk about in the next slide, you don't need a bird feeder. You just need to look at this tree. And, they generally bloom in, I like to call it the merry month of May, right? And they have these flowers are not particularly showy, but they're still kind of cool. And the flowers turn into these berries, which are in this picture down here. And this is the black cherry leaf, the shiny leaf right here. Like I said, here can grow up to 100 feet. This to the right here, I won't really talk about in this presentation. I'll just mention this is a non-native plant called Asiatic bittersweet. Okay, it's a vine that if you see it, you probably should remove it. It does strangle trees and will take them down, native and non-native alike. But going back to the black cherry, these are the berries that the birds love so much. So again, if you have a black cherry tree, please keep it. All right, so let's move on. We're going to talk about shrubs next. So this is a swamp forest. You can see the skunk cabbage in the back, but I want to focus on, it might be hard to see in this photo here, but this is a spice bush, right? And I want to talk about this in more detail in a few slides, but I just want to say, if you go into the woods about now, they're still in bloom. They maybe have another week left or so, but they have these little yellow blooms. But again, I'll talk about it in more. It's a plant that I love so much, and I'll talk about it in a few slides. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is maple leaf viburnum. All right. It's pretty common throughout New Jersey. Like I said, with the exception of the pine barrens, so maybe around the streams there you might find it. But if you look at the leaves here, they kind of look like maple leaf, hence the name, right? And to me, they particularly look like a striped maple tree, which doesn't grow in Klomburg woods, but it does kind of look like a maple leaf. So without the flowers here, right, and which, by the way, turn into berries or drupes, without it, you might think that you found a young maple tree, maybe even the striped maple, right? Because it kind of looks like that, but it's actually a maple leaf viburnum. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is picture here. This is a fairly tall maple leaf viburnum. These are the mature drupes on the top here. So they mature about maybe around August or so. They're green, they become dark purple. So I did want to mention, I have here that they're popular with striped skunk and cottontail rabbit, white-tailed deer. So white-tailed deer do like to munch on the plant, not so much the drupes, but the plant itself. So this plant actually will have a hard time getting to this height if you have a large white-tailed deer population, this picture was not taken at the celery farm, but I wanted to include it so you could see what it does look like. If it gets to a decent height, because usually if you have a large deer population, they'll be around the bottom, like more closer to the ground level here. Okay. But it's not the droops aren't really a super beneficial, or I shouldn't say beneficial. They're not a high wildlife. They're not that popular with wildlife. They will really only be eaten after other more nutritious berries or more tastier berries like blueberries or service berries, etc. Once those are gone and these are the only things left, then they'll be eaten. But generally speaking, they're not super popular with wildlife. Okay, so let's move on. And here we go. Here's spice bush. So here's a closer up of the flowers of the spice bush, right? Here's another picture with skunk cabbage under the understory. And this is generally, for most people, if you're familiar with spice bush, this is about like the best time to recognize it in the field, because once it gets its leaves, it's a little bit more challenging to identify. But this is a common way to identify it in Klomburg woods or any other natural area in New Jersey, North Jersey, is that these flowers bloom around the same time as the non-native forsythia, right? So I know many people, when you see, the forsythia bushes blooming, it's like, oh, thank God something's blooming after such a long winter. And now you got nice, beautiful flowers, and they are beautiful, but I prefer to go into the woods and look for a native plant like spice bush and look for these flowers, because to me, that's, more beneficial for the environment than forsythia. Not that forsythia is not a beautiful bush. So it is part, like I said here, part of the laurel family of plants, grows from 4 to 16 feet. As I mentioned, it's a welcome site, especially for pollinators. Another thing that's why it's called spice bush, that if you break off a piece of the stem, it smells sweet. It smells like a nice spicy scent. So you'll enjoy that odor if you were to do that. So as I said here, in this picture here, is particularly, this is skunk cabbage, but you'll have skunk cabbage, false hellebora, which looks similar to skunk cabbage. Won't talk about it too much here. But the shrub spreads via root sprouts. So you can have kind of like the American beech, where you have the mother tree or mother shrub in this case, and you'll have a whole bunch of other shrubs, that are all part of the same clone. So yeah, spice bush is a wonderful, I look forward to it blooming every year. I really do. And it's I wanted to show this here. This is a picture of the immature green berries. They are a favorite food of wood thrush, veery, and also white-tailed deer and possum. So, and of course, it's a major host to the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. Okay. So let's go on to the herbaceous species. This picture was taken here at the Celery farm. This one is a yellow downy violet. So let's move on. So this is Canada Mayflower. These are just coming up now. They're shade tolerant and they can carpet the floor. Like you would think they're an invasive species. So if you're familiar with invasive species, generally speaking, like an invasive species will just take over everything. And the Canada Mayflower kind of has that, right? When you see them, like they don't just come up with a couple, they come up with a ton and they'll just carpet the whole floor. It's very low growing, but maybe that tall, 6 inches or so. Plants that only have one leaf are immature. They don't bloom until the second year. This is an example of, Canada Mayflower carpeting the forest floor. So it's like, once it comes up, it's like, hey, where's everything else? All I see is Canada Mayflower. Well, that's all right. They're a native plant. So it's good to see Canada Mayflower coming up. This is a picture of them in bloom. So they got these nice, cool little flowers here. Again, this is a very low to the ground understory plant, shade tolerant. You'll find this in Klomburg woods. So it'll be in bloom in probably a couple weeks. You'll see this flower in bloom. Okay. And this is the berries. After the flowers go away, they come out the berries. It's not a major wildlife plant as far as like what eats these berries. It's kind of similar to the maple leaf viburnum. Like they get eaten after all the tastier berries or high quality berries are taken. Then these are the lower quality that then they'll be eaten. Okay, but the wildlife that do consume them are the eastern chipmunks. You got the white-footed mice. Okay, so that's what will eat them or has been documented to eat them. Okay, here's a beautiful plant, right? The eastern skunk cabbage. Some people love this plant. Some people hate this plant. I'm one of the people that love the plant because this plant is the first native wildflower. Yes, that's actually a wildflower, and the flower is actually inside the space here, right? That comes, and I've seen this thing coming out of the ground as early as December in some years, but generally speaking, it comes about February. And even when there's snow on the ground, this guy will bloom and come out of the ground. It actually generates heat, will melt the snow that's growing around it. So it's really, really cool. And this one here is this guy's been out for a little bit because the skunk cabbage leaf is already starting to come up. It does have an odor. And because it does release, if you were to like torn one of the leaves or something, that it does have a nasty smell. I haven't personally wanted to play around with that. I don't recommend doing it, but that's my understanding is that if you were to rip a leaf or maybe you have yourself and you've experienced it, it's not a pleasant smell, but it does help. Like as I say here, it helps attract flies who cross-pollinate. They lay their eggs in the spadix. Okay, it's not related to actual cabbage. Okay, so it kind of superficially really looks like cabbage, but it's not related to actual cabbage. It's not really edible. So don't, really any of the plants I mentioned here are not edible. So they can be pretty big, when you go to see them, maybe even now, they get to pretty impressive sizes by mid-August, or I'm sorry, midsummer. They're starting to wilt, they're starting to fade. And again, as I mentioned, they can help melt the snow around it. They use the energy stored in their roots. That's how they generate the heat. And it's a favorite of black bears. Black bears have been known to eat these young green leaves in early spring. So something to think about when you explore the woods, right? Klomburg woods, maybe occasionally we'll have a bear, but it's not too frequent. Okay, trout lily. So this is a perennial flower. It's got, not every leaf does, but it does produce solitary yellow flowers. It's a very common forest wildflower in the deciduous forest of New Jersey, right? And deciduous, if you're not familiar with that term, all that means is that the leaves come off the tree every fall or shrubs every fall, right? And they come back every spring. That's all that means. So it does help enhance the forest floor by gathering the trace mineral phosphorus from spring rain runoffs to its roots. So it does play an important factor. And then it releases the phosphorus back into so the trees can absorb that and take advantage of the nutrients. Okay, so why is it called trout lily? That's a weird name, right? Why would you call that? Well, if you look at the leaves, apparently the brown mottled leaves, they resemble the coloring of brook trout. So that's why they're called trout lily. They're called other names too, but trout lily is the most common name. That's something I wanted to mention here too, right? So the scientific name, you'll have a scientific name because that name is found everywhere, right? Trout lily, it's not called trout lily everywhere. It might be called adder's tongue or something else somewhere else. And if you call it trout lily, someone else might not know what plant you're talking about. So that's a little sidetrack. Just wanted to bring that up there. A cool fact is that they do form colonies, as it's happening now in the celery farm. Its leaves also, just like the Canada Mayflower, they will carpet the forest floor before the canopy fills in, right? And something else to consider, right? That some colonies of trout lily, and this is yellow trout lily, okay, may actually be older than the forest that surrounds it. That's right. They might be a lot older than the forest that grows around it. So, you've had a clear cut or some kind of disturbance maybe 100 years ago. These flowers might have already been there and they stayed put, even after disturbance. So that's something that I thought was interesting and kind of cool. So many plants, they do, when you go into, if you're going to Klomburg woods right now, you might say, hey, where are the flowers? I only see a bunch of leaves. Well, that's because many of them will only produce one leaf, and that they generally don't flower for the first 4 to 7 years. So it takes quite a while. So when you see that yellow trout lily flower, make sure to appreciate that because it took a long time for that flower to come about. Okay. All right. So this guy here, I mentioned I did a walk here at the celery farm in the fall. And so this is a fall blooming plant. So you won't find it in bloom right now. But generally, actually, I should correct myself. Probably like mid July through. I've seen it blooming up into December. That's why I said it's a long blooming plant. It's white snake root, and it's called white snake root because at one time, this is not correct, but people thought that this plant would help heal snake bites, but it's actually not correct. It's actually a toxic plant. It's a poisonous plant. It is a native plant, but it's a poisonous plant. An interesting fact is that it's thought to have caused the death of Abraham Lincoln. That's right, President Lincoln's mother, through milk poisoning. Okay, so let me give you a little backstory on that. So what happened was this plant evidently was growing near a pasture where some cows were eating, and they browsed on it, and they became sick. But people that got milk from the cows didn't know the cows were sick. Well, it's called milk sickness, and the poison from white snake root went in the milk, and apparently Abraham Lincoln's mother drank this poison milk and unfortunately had passed away due to this plant. So it's not a favorite plant, needless to say, to have around any kind of livestock. You don't want to have it. It's like I said here, it's found, you'll find it near the forest edges of Klomburg woods. It's not really picky about habitat preference. It can be kind of weedy too. It can grow in deep shade. It can grow even in like partial sun. And as I mentioned, it's got a long blooming time. And so this is a typical picture here of the habitat, right? And here's outside the woods, this particular one, where you'll find it growing near various goldenrod species. But goldenrod is the flower here with yellow. And I just want to sidetrack a little bit about goldenrod. That many people have the misconception that hay fever is caused by goldenrod. It's actually caused by ragweed. Goldenrod is harmless, doesn't do anything. So I used to believe that as well when I was younger, but now I know the culprit is ragweed, which is also a native plant. But going back to this, so white snake root, you'll generally find it in an environment such as this. I usually leave it alone. I don't touch it. It's a native plant. It's good. It is good for pollinations, especially late pollinators. Like I said, I've seen this on, if we've had a warm early winter, I've seen this growing. And actually at Montclair State University this past December, there was still a white snake root fully in bloom, no sign of dying. So it is a long blooming plant. Okay. So we got one fern we're going to talk about today, and this is the picture of it here. It's called sensitive fern. Why is it called that? Well, it's called sensitive fern not because it's sensitive in the sense that we're going to hurt its feelings, right? It's sensitive because it's sensitive to first frost. So if you have the first frost of the season, this fern will actually pass away. It will die from the top. I mean, the roots will stay alive and send out new spores and everything come the following spring. It is more sun tolerant than other fern species. It is common in the celery farm. We saw it on the walk that we did this past fall. It spreads by both rhizome and wind dispersed spores. So there's no seeds involved when you have a fern. It grows, by basically like spores and then the rhizome. So the spores are on the underside of the leaf here, okay? And then they will blow. And actually, one interesting thing about the sensitive fern is that it's pretty common to find it, and I don't know why, to be honest, but it's pretty common to find this fern in an urban environment, okay? Like Central Park even will have some sensitive fern that are growing spontaneous. And so if you're gonna find a fern in a more altered or man-made environment, you're going to find sensitive fern. It's just how it's been. So it can grow up to 3.5 feet tall. So it's get a pretty decent size for a fern, form large colonies, can be weeded, can crowd out other plants, both native and non-native. Okay. So yeah, this is still a beneficial plant, regardless if it's quote unquote weedy. I would leave this there. It is a native plant. And I think it's a beautiful fern, personally. I think all ferns are beautiful, but sensitive fern, since it's so common, especially, it's a beautiful fern. Okay. So one of my last slides here, I wanted to talk about the white-tailed deer impact on forest plants. And as I mentioned, kind of alluded to earlier, so when you have with the maple leaf viburnum, when you have so many white-tailed deer, they prevent native plants from really growing. They'll wipe out the native plants because they don't have anything to eat. There's too many deer in a small area. There's supposed to be something to the effect of like, about 3 to 4 deer per 20 to 30 acres, or maybe, I'm sorry, 1 deer per 20 to 30 acres. So that's about, the celery farm should have maybe 3 or 4 deer altogether. But if you're familiar with the celery farm, you've been there, you've seen more than 3 or 4 deer, which is why the deer fence was constructed. So when you have so many deer in such a small space, they will prevent native plants from growing. And then if you have non-native plants like Japanese barberry as an example growing, which is also found in Klomburg woods, they don't eat that. It also hurts to eat. I'm sure it's full of thorns, but they don't eat that. So that plant will actually gain a foothold and grow and grow and grow. And meanwhile, the native plants will start to die out basically, and they don't have a chance to come back because the non-native plants or invasive plants, so to speak, have taken over. And so they're kind of a big problem. They are a beautiful animal. I love seeing a white-tailed deer whenever I spot them, but I do recognize that they can be an issue with forest regeneration. So if you look at many forests, even Klomburg woods, you might not see so many young saplings. You'll see a lot of mature trees, but you really maybe you see an occasional one but they generally will just have mature canopies. So that kind of raises a question for the future, like what will the forests of Klomburg woods or any of these woods look like when you have so many deer and they don't have the young trees aren't getting a chance to grow and take the place when these guys die and fall down. What trees are going to take their place? Is it going to be a non-native tree? Is it going to be like for example, a tree of heaven or princess tree or something to that effect, or is it going to be more of a native tree like a red maple or something like that? So that's something to consider. But again, celery farms, they can they're very active about it. They put up the deer fence, and it's a good thing. So that concludes my presentation. I just want to say this is also a native. Want to say that this is a wildflower that's growing right now on the celery farm, Spring Beauty, hence its name. It is a beauty of a plant. And that's it. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to look at this presentation, and I'm open for questions if anyone has questions or comments.
Mike, Kurt Munz here, the moderator. Someone gave good feedback that that the sound was indeed on. The reason I panicked there was that supposedly everyone, all the attendees, see what's on my computer. And since the sound wasn't on mine, I thought it would be prudent to restart. So I thank everyone for bearing with us. Thank Mike as well for that glitch. Okay, there is a question for you on the thing if you'd like to hit Q&A, Mike, and you can answer
Sure.
that.
Okay.
Actually, a comment.
Let's see here. I think I just hit this thing, right? Dee Dee, if you can hear me, thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Before I ask it, I just want everyone to, when they go to the celery farm now, and now that you know some of the plants and trees there, that to look into the deer exclosure, because you will see trout lily and trillium and eastern spring beauties, the flower on the screen. And there might be spice bush in there. Now that I know what it looks like, I'm going to go back and see if I can recognize it. But my question was, so based on the photography that we knew the woods were still there like 90 years ago, did you see any trees in that area that were, 100-year plus old trees?
That's a good question. They vary in ages, and it's an interesting question too, because if you look, not just Klomburg woods, but if you look at the typical forest age of really any forest in this area, they're generally even age because around the turn of the century or so, most forests were completely clear cut, for whether it was for charcoal burning for the iron furnaces or for any other reason. And so when they came back, or for farmland in the case of the celery farm, so when the farmland's abandoned and comes back and it reverts, they all generally tend to be about the same age. So I would say, I mean, there's nothing like super large, but again, when you look at a tree, the size doesn't always matter as far as the old. You could have a small tree and it can be very, very old depending on the species and the location. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, I think I've seen some probably close to 100-year-old trees, but I wouldn't say too old, if that helps.
Mhm.
I think I have a couple here. Okay. So I got a question here from, do you lead walks in Klomburg Woods? I would be open to it. I haven't yet, but I definitely would be open to.
That'd be great, Mike.
Okay. All right. So, and then Dee Dee, thank you. You said that it's farmed many years ago, and so the trees there are not ancient. That's true. That's definitely true. Okay. And Dee Dee also said there's lots of red maple, pin oak, swamp white oak, all wetland species. Absolutely. Those are all found in Klomburg Woods, and also beautiful trees, every one of them. I especially love swamp white oak. So
We noticed in the deer exclosure, normally the spice bush, you'll just see it grow up with a stalk, and then it has the little flowers this time of year and the leaves. But in the deer exclosure, there's little clumps at the base of every one of them. And I don't know if the deer had been eating them, but if you look inside the deer exclosure and outside, there's a little clump of greenery at the base of every one in the deer exclosure. So I think it's probably, they maybe nibble the new shoots when they come up, but it's noticeable. If you look one side of the trail and the other around the stem down at the ground, there's a little clump of green leaves, in another month or so, but it's definitely noticeable inside the deer exclosure. But yeah, great spice bush just all over. So nice.
it's awesome. I'm gonna have to take a look at that next time I go, see how it looks. So I think we have something else here. Let me go and see. So we have a question that says, an aside, I've noticed many magnolia trees seem to have died off after this past winter. Is there a reason for that? That's a good question. I don't really know. I haven't noticed that on my side, but I don't have too many magnolia trees around me. I'm not sure about that. I could look into it, but I don't know, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
The deer ate a smaller one at the fell house that we put in about 3 years ago. There's just nothing left of it. They're little, maybe 8-inch stems, and it had been a full, Rosslers had put it in, and every year they gift us a tree. And there's the smaller ones. This is what I'm talking to, they ended up eating everything off almost down to the ground. But the bigger ones I've noticed are blooming.
Okay. So it's maybe it's a more like a local occurrence, that's not happening all over. So, okay. All right. A walk in the Klomburg Woods would be great. Thanks for a great presentation. I took notes. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And hopefully we can do a walk maybe this spring or summertime.
Sure.
And then let's see, we got another question. Those magnolias that died, the blossoms are non-natives. Do not plant non-natives. Exactly. Yeah. They're not native to the area. So, there could be numerous reasons why. Yeah, I'm all about planting native plants over non-native. Absolutely.
The tree guys always want to cut the wild cherries, like when they're walking around the fell house. They'll be like, oh, I can get rid of that cherry for them. Like, don't touch it.
Oh. Yeah, absolutely not. Like I have one right outside my window here, and like, oh man, it's when I'm working from home, it's a real pleasure to look at, especially when the berries are there and see all the birds. And I've seen many cedar waxwings on them. It's definitely one of my favorite trees. I didn't think much of it, when I first discovered it, but after researching and then now having one outside my window and seeing them also at the celery farm, it's just like, wow, this is this is really an amazing tree. And, you know, some people don't always like it because they think it's like a weedy kind of tree, but anything that helps wildlife, I think is a good thing to have, you know.
Yeah.
And let's see here. And Dee Dee said natives do not die like that, talking about the magnolias. That's true. Okay. So I think that's it. Unless, did anyone else have any other questions? Oh, I think there is something else here. Okay. American beaches hanging on to their oh, let me hit to the live. American beaches hanging on to their leaves, especially when young. What constitutes youngish? Well, that's a good question, right? So, I would say probably under 100 years, maybe like even under 75. Or let me think about it. Probably like more in the 25 to 50 range. That sounds about right. That you would find it, but it does. You will still occasionally see American beeches hanging on to their leaves even after that. But if you look at like a mature American beech tree, like a decent sized one or the mother one, right, so to speak, in the forest, generally speaking, maybe the lower branches, but generally speaking, you will not find any on those guys. You'll just see it on the more smaller ones. So I would say about 25, 50 years. Hope that helps with your question. Oh, got another one. It does. Thanks. Thank you. You're welcome. All right. Any more questions? Definitely open if anyone has any comments, questions, anything at all.
Oh, thanks for finding those other shagbark hickories for us across the stream. That you remember that walk? That was great because that one died. That my favorite tree.
Oh, I know. Yeah, by the Greenway, right? By the Greenway entrance,
Yeah.
that one had passed. Yeah.
Show the scouts that, but yeah, you found those other two across the. So I look at them all the time now and keep any vines out of them. So that's
Awesome. Yeah, they're a really cool tree. I love shagbark. You're welcome. Thank you so much, Dee Dee.
All right. Is that it?
I think so. Unless anyone else has any last minute comments or questions or anything, I think that's it.
This was great. I really can't wait to get back to the celery farm and try to find some of these plants.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Mike. Always wonderful. And it's just an education from the first slide to the last. And I took notes too. for a few.
Thanks so much.
All right.
All right.
We will be in touch. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.